Good morning, guys, and welcome out to Revolution. We have a special guest with us today, Nehemia Gordon, and we're going to be chatting about Revelation 16:5. We're going to be talking about Jehovah. We're going to be talking about I am. And these are some topics that Nehemia has some expertise on because Nehemia knows the Hebrew language quite well. He studied these issues, and he seems to have come out against mainstream scholarship with some interesting information about Yahweh and some other names. And so I'm just going to introduce Nehemia. So Nehemia, how are you doing?
I'm doing well, thanks. Shalom.
Shalom from Australia. So Nehemia, you're in Texas, is that correct?
I'm currently in Dallas, Texas.
Okay, excellent. And so maybe you can start off, Nehemia, telling us a little bit about yourself, your scholarship and your language skills that would be different to just the average person like me, an average Aussie or the average American. Maybe you can explain the difference between yourself and people like us.
Oh, well, I don't want to. I don't know enough about you to speak about any differences, but. So I have a PhD in biblical studies from Bar-Ilan University, which is in Ramat Gan, Israel. I did my undergrad and my master's at Hebrew University of Jerusalem. Undergrad was a double major, biblical studies and archaeology. Found out archaeology was kind of boring. I wanted to be a consumer of archaeology, not a producer. And so I did my master's in biblical studies at Hebrew University. And I've done a whole bunch of stuff over the years. Worked on the Dead Sea Scrolls. What I focus on now is what's behind me here in the background, which is medieval Hebrew Bible manuscripts. So in the case of the New Testament, you actually have some really fascinating pieces of evidence. You have manuscripts that are generally dated to within 100 years of the authorship of the books. In the case of the Tanakh, we don't have that. Our earliest surviving fragment is from 650 BCE, which, if you believe the biblical accounts, which I do, then it's a book of Numbers. So it was written about, it's a copy from about, I'm so bad at math, but let's put the book of Numbers being written around 1400 BCE, which, secular scholars don't believe that, but I do. So that's an 800-year difference. And that's only a few verses from Numbers 6 and one verse from Deuteronomy. Our earliest complete copy of the entire Hebrew Bible is from the year 1008. It's the Leningrad Codex. Now we have fragments and we have pieces of biblical books, pretty much whole biblical books from before that. But from beginning to end, our first complete Bible is from 1008, which is kind of shocking. So 2,400 years, 400 years after, at least, parts of it were written later, right? The Ezra was written in, let's say, 450 BCE. So even that, our earliest copy of Ezra is 1,400 years later. Right. Well, that's not exactly accurate because we have earlier copies from before 1008. Our earliest complete Bible that includes Ezra is from 1,400 years later. So we're in a kind of different ballgame when it comes to the Hebrew Bible, the Tanakh, than we are with the New Testament. Okay. But then on the flip side, we also had scribal traditions that are very different from what you had in the New Testament. You had this obsession with individual letters, and I think I could call it an obsession. There was this idea that is attributed to Rabbi Akiva in the early 2nd century. Maybe this is not where we wanted to go here. Let's not go down a rabbit trail.
No, that's fine. Please rabbit trail.
So my background, that's my academic background. I'm currently the director of the Institute for Hebrew Bible Manuscript Research, which I founded. People can find it online, ihbmr.com. On my religious side, I wear two hats, a religious one and a academic one. On my religious side, I'm what's known as a Karaite Jew. That is a Jew who believes strictly in the Old Testament and not in what's known as the oral law. I've written a book about that, the Hebrew Yeshua versus the Greek Jesus. And you might think that's strange. Why'd you write a book that mentions Jesus when you're talking about the oral law? You got to read the book. Or we could talk about that, but that's all we talk about the rest of the time. And I have nehemiaswall.com or nehemiaswall.com. You can see more of my religious side and also some academic stuff there mixed in as well. So, yeah. So I am completely fluent in, as much as anybody could be, in, I suppose, in ancient Hebrew. Nobody speaks biblical Hebrew today, but we can read it. I'm fluent in modern Hebrew as well. I took 2 years of Greek at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem. I don't have nearly the expertise in Greek that I do in Hebrew. I can read a little bit of Arabic and a few other languages that are very... I once had a teacher who said he spoke or he read a dozen languages, but then we came to find out he included Ammonite and Moabite and Edomite, which are all based, and Canaanite, which are all, you can learn those in a few weeks if you know biblical Hebrew well. So I know those two; those are pretty easy. So.
Wow, that's an impressive. That's very impressive for someone who, I don't know Hebrew fluently, I don't know Greek fluently, and it's always very enlightening to listen to your material, specifically on the name of Jehovah. And so, can you explain your scholarship into the name of Jehovah and what you found?
Mm-hmm. So first of all, I would pronounce it Jehovah. And actually behind me, and I just literally minutes before this started, I had to upload a background image, and there was just something on my computer, some random image that I must have been looking at one point, and so it was downloaded. And so there you can see the letters. Can they see my mouse? No, they probably can't. So I have to point to it. And I was going to there. So you see there is the Hebrew letters Yud, He, Vav, He. That is, oh, cool. And that is what you say in English is Jehovah. Most people today, most scholars at least, say Yahweh. And one of the things that jumps out for anybody who doesn't, or who does read Hebrew, is that there's a missing vowel. And what do I mean by a missing vowel? So based on the way the Hebrew vowel points work, is you can't have a letter in the middle of a word like that, except in certain circumstances, which doesn't have a vowel attached to it. If it's the end of a syllable, then it has these dots that indicate that it doesn't have a vowel, but it's the end of a syllable, right? So, and actually, we have another example over here, if I can get my finger straight, because it's
I'll try and zoom.
So there, and then let's see if I get here closer. Now it's disappearing my finger. So let's find one closer to my head. So I'm actually looking for an example where there's a word. Oh, here, beautiful. Oh, wait, that must be your slide or your background. So here is the word Vayomer, and he said, and notice there's a little line above this letter. And that tells you that that letter is silent. So that's an exception to the rule where you can have a letter in the middle of a word which isn't pronounced. And in this case, the letter is part of the root, Amar, to say, and Vayomer is and he said. All right, so in God's name, and what's known as the Tetragrammaton, the four-letter name of God, there is no symbol like that in this case. There are actually manuscripts that do have it, but that's a little bit more complicated. That actually proves my hypothesis. So in any event, but let's not get into that. It's a bit complicated. So here we're missing a vowel, and really if you went back into the 10th century and you said to any Jew who read Tiberian Hebrew, said, read that the way it's written, they wouldn't be able to read it. It's unreadable this way. So I came up with this hypothesis, which is that the scribes left out that vowel because they didn't want people to read it. Now, why wouldn't they want people to read it? Because Jewish tradition is you don't read that name. It goes back to at least Talmudic times, meaning we have this going back. So this manuscript is the Aleppo Codex. It's considered the most accurate copy of the Bible in Hebrew. And the Talmud was completed in the year 500. And off the top of my head, I don't remember if it's what's known as a Praita. So it could be from the year 200 or earlier. I think it is from the 2nd century. And it's this idea that they would read the name as Adonai. Right. And all right. So this is the Jewish tradition I grew up with. My father was an Orthodox rabbi. I wasn't raised as a Karaite Jew, meaning strictly Old Testament Jew. I was raised with the oral law, with the teachings of the rabbis as being Mosaic revelation. That's what I was taught. I don't believe that. That's what I was taught. And there was a time I guess I did believe that. I didn't know any better. So and most Jews who are religious do believe that there were two Torahs revealed on Mount Sinai. There was the written Torah and the oral Torah, and the oral Torah was later written down by rabbis, or the contents of it were, right? Maybe not word for word. So the tradition is you read this word as Adonai, and Adonai means Lord, or really my great Lord, if we want to be really technical about it. But it's written Yud He Vav He. And even rabbis admit that in ancient times it was pronounced. For example, in the Mishnah, which is the early part of the oral law, that was written down around, or not written down, it was composed around the year 210. So in the Mishnah, they say that in the temple, when the priests would recite the priestly blessing, they would say the actual name. And then outside the temple, they would say Adonai. So that could be probably is our earliest solid evidence, as solid as a tradition from 200 years after the events is, or 150 years later. That's our first evidence that there were people pronouncing the name of God as Lord. And that's where you get in the King James, where it says Lord in all caps. So the Lord in all caps represents the Hebrew Yud He Vav He, the Tetragrammaton, with the intermediary of the Greek, where it was written down as Kurios. Oh, beautiful. There you have it. So that Lord in all caps, and I love that Gothic font, even though I have trouble reading it. And so that represents the Hebrew. Whenever you see that in the Hebrew, you know that more than likely, although not in every case, unfortunately, but in most cases, 99.9% of cases, Lord there is Yud He Vav He, the name of God. In some instances, by the way, when it says praise the Lord in the King James, if I'm not mistaken, and someone can correct me if I'm wrong in the comments, you can correct me maybe. When it says praise the Lord, the Hebrew has Yah. But so that's the exception to the rule in around 49 instances. I didn't count them, but it's 49 in Hebrew. So I think that those 49, or most of those in the King James, are going to be Lord with caps. But in every other instance, Lord with caps is Yud He Vav He, this word that Jews traditionally pronounce as Adonai, which means my great Lord. But in ancient times, they pronounced it, even in the time of the Second Temple, in the temple itself. And then there's another thing in the Mishnah that says that on Yom Kippur, the high priest would proclaim this name, and the entire congregation would go through a special ritual when they heard it, right? So, all right. So, what is the pronunciation of this name? That was my burning desire. Before I got into academia, before any of that, I had a burning desire to know what that name is. How is it pronounced? And I read lots of theories, right? There's lots. The scholarly literature is, you'll hear today scholars say it's Yahweh. But actually, they'll say that's a scholarly guess. The Anchor Bible Dictionary says it's a scholarly guess. And among scholars themselves, there's a consensus to use Yahweh, but there's a lot of different theories. There's one from the 19th century that says it has the same vowels as Pharaoh. So it would be Yahweh, right? Or Yahvo in the, let's say, Tiberian pronunciation, right? There's a lot of different theories about what it is. There's a rabbi from the 12th century who says that it's Yihveh, right? Is it Yihveh? I don't know. It could be. It's possible. But my prayer was, and this is, I want to put my religious hat here, just make that clear. My prayer to the Almighty to God was, I want to know this based on what was preserved by your people in the original manuscripts that we have. We don't have the manuscript that Moses or Joshua wrote, but we have copies of copies of copies. And I want to see this in the scribes that preserved your manuscripts. I want to see what at least they thought it was, because that's the closest I can ever get to anything. To even know that this is a verse that was spoken by the creator of the universe and recorded in the Hebrew Bible, what I have is the manuscripts, right? I don't have the original copy written by Samuel in this case, if I'm not mistaken. This is Samuel. Or Gad the seer, or whoever wrote this, right? It's the book of Samuel. What I have is the manuscripts that were preserved. So that was my prayer. And I'll make a long story short so we can get on to more recent developments. And I have a video on my website, nehemiaswall.com. It's on the Open Door series. I think I talk about this in a lot more detail than I'll go into it. But long story short, I found places in the manuscripts where it did have the full vowels. And by the way, years later, maybe 20 years after I discovered this, I read a scholar who said the same thing I said. And look, there's some people who say, well, and I've actually been told this by let's say, people in media, don't mention the other scholars that discovered this. Pretend that you discovered it. No, you see, where I come from in my field, if other people discovered it before me, it actually makes a stronger case.
That's right.
This isn't just my wackadoodle theory. There are scholars before me who came up with some pieces of this, not all of it together. But, for example, there was a scholar named Martin Russell in Germany who said that the scribes left out one of the vowels so people wouldn't pronounce it. Right? So that's I thought that was my discovery, but people had said that before me. And by the way, it's not obvious why they left out one of the vowels. There's another theory that they pronounced the name as Shema, which is the Aramaic of Hashem, the name. But there's reasons to think that's not the case that I won't go into that are very technical. I found there was a place where there wasn't the vowels in multiple places, and eventually I found over 2,000 manuscripts, which wasn't necessary, frankly, right? After the second or third witness, you could say, okay, you have multiple instances in multiple manuscripts. At least somebody could feasibly think that that's, meaning among the scribes, could have feasibly thought that that was Jehovah. That's the name you get with those vowels. Jehovah, which is obviously the source of the English Jehovah. Now, here's the really interesting thing. So people make a big deal about the J and the Y. Is it Jehovah or Jehovah or Jehovah? Right? My name's Nehemia. Some people call me Nehemia, Nehemiah. Right? Okay, close enough. Just don't call me Baldy. That's what I say. That's a very sensitive topic. So I notice you're wearing a hat too. So
I've got a bit of hair on
top.
You
have hair. All right, now I have hair envy. Okay, so with the full vowels, you would read that as Jehovah. Now, is that the name that Moses used? Well, I have no access to that kind of information. Right? What I have access to is there are scribes who recorded it this way. Now, maybe those scribes thought it was Adonai, and they're putting in the vowels of Adonai. That's the standard explanation. In fact, in my field in academia, that's a fact, and that's common knowledge. Except there are people before me. Again, I discovered that I didn't discover this. That's beautiful for me, to find out I'm not the one who discovered this, that great minds think alike. There were people before me who said, oh, well, why wouldn't they have the vowel if it's Adonai? And, well, that's because the scribes knew this to be, or believed it to be, let's say. Who knows what no is, right? The scribes believed this to be the original pronunciation, even though they read it as Adonai. Right? So that's there were people who said this in the 1800s, who said this. In the 1830s, there's a rabbi named Samuel David Luzzatto who said that, oh, well, and by the way, this is a guy who wrote a grammar, right? So there's something that I call, and I created this phrase, there's something that scholars use, which I call the ignorant Christian hypothesis. And I think we should stop on that for a moment. And
I think I've got a copy of the grammar here.
Oh, okay. It's grammar. Oh, nice. All right. I think so it's actually a grammar of. Oh no, that's a different guy.
It's a different guy. Okay.
Yeah, I don't know who that is. I can't read it actually. Is it David?
Sorry, it's Davidson.
Davidson. No, that's somebody else. Okay. I couldn't see the end of that name. I just saw David. No, Samuel David Luzzatto was a rabbi in Italy. He's considered, in a sense, a bridge between traditional Jewish knowledge and modern scholarly academic knowledge, because he was completely immersed in the Jewish traditional world, but also in the scholarly academic world. And he unhesitatingly would say, well, I don't, the people who made the vowel points, they got it wrong. He writes that all over the place, but not in this case. In this case, he said they got it right. And he's not the only one. Other rabbis have said that it's Jehovah. And they knew the Hebrew grammar, right? So what's the ignorant Christian hypothesis? So and it's not my hypothesis. This is something Christian scholars have put out. It's this idea that the name Jehovah is an impossible, or Jehovah is an impossible hybrid. And that phrase, impossible hybrid, is actually used. It's an impossible hybrid. It's the letters of God's name, of the Tetragrammaton, with the vowels of Adonai. So that makes it a hybrid. What makes it impossible? No one's been able to explain that to me. Maybe I'm not smart enough to understand it. There's actually, let's say it is a hybrid. It's still not impossible. Well, it's impossible based on an assumption they have, which is that the name Yud-Heh-Vav-Heh is a simple verb and has to have the vowels that you'd have in a verb. Well, who says that? They just made that up.
Right, okay.
Could be, but there's no reason to think that it's names. So here's the thing about Hebrew names. Names are often based on verbs, but don't have the vowels they would have if they were verbs. And why is that? Because names are nouns, and the vowels can be modified and adapted to the noun. Okay, so there's a difference between what like my name Nehemia means Jehovah or Yah more directly. Yah comforts. Okay, but if I said Yah comforts in a sentence, it wouldn't be Nehemia or Nehemia. It would be, in this case, it would be the perfect form, Nehemia. So wait a minute, why am I not Nehemia? Because that's not how names work. Not always, at least. Right? They usually work in that the vowels are modified. Okay, in any event, meaning there's a verb behind the name that we'll get to, I hope, if we have time. But you wouldn't expect, really, the name to be the exact vowels of the verb. So this impossible part of the impossible hybrid, we can just forget that. That's nonsense. That's just speculation. Whether it's a hybrid or not, okay. So the hybrid is based on this idea of cricative. I won't go into that, but there's certain words that are written one way and read a different way. Right? And so you have the actual vowels of a completely different word. And that's not an uncommon thing in the Hebrew Bible. It happens all the time. And we could go into why that is. You actually have one right here, interestingly.
Okay.
Yeah, so there in the margin it says, oh, beautiful. It says, and then we have to, if you can go over a little bit to over here, because it's referring to something in the first.
I wish I could.
Okay.
Actually, I think I can. Hang on. Here we go. That's better.
So it says, Vayocher. So here it's a bit different. So here it's the same vowels. But in any event, you see here it says kri or kre, and that means read it as. So there's one word written here in the body of the text with vowels. And there's another word in the margin, and it says read it as this other word. And here the vowels wouldn't actually change necessarily. They're the same vowels. All right. So this is not an uncommon thing. It's called kri or kre, cricative it's also called. So this is a common thing. So the claim is that Jehovah or Yud-Heh-Vav-Heh has the vowels of Adonai, but the letters of Yud-Heh-Vav-Heh. And I liken it to what Isaac said when he was blind, or maybe he had really bad cataracts, and he was feeling his son, and he said, "I can hear the voice of Jacob, but it's the feel of Esau." Right, because Jacob was deceiving him and put on, sheepskin to make, because Esau was very hairy. So he says, "Hakol kol Yaakov, v'hayadayim midei Esav." He says the voice is the voice of Jacob, but the hands are the hands of Esau. So did I say that backwards? The voice is the voice of Jacob. I don't even remember what I said. The voice is the voice of Jacob, but the hands are the hands of Esau. So that's the claim for this name, that it has the vowels of the word Adonai, except it doesn't have the vowels of Adonai. Patently, blatantly, the vowels of Adonai are slightly different with an ah, and they say, oh, well, that's because it's an aleph, not a yud. That's not how cricative works. Cricative, the system of it's written one way in the body, like here, and then in the margin it's written another way. It could have impossible vowels in this word. It's totally like there are examples that I've brought, like the word anu, which is read as anachnu in Jeremiah. It could have completely different, unrelated vowels to the word the way it's written, and it doesn't care. It just has the vowels of the way it's read. There's actually really cool examples. Well, I won't go into it. It's complicated. It's completely so-called impossible vowels. If it's cricative, if that's your explanation, then the vowels will be impossible for that particular word. It's not an issue. So why doesn't this have, if I can get to it, Why doesn't this have the actual vowels of Adonai? And my hypothesis was, well, once we put in that missing O, it's Jehovah, and Adonai would be Yahovah, and it doesn't have those vowels. And it turns out people before me noticed this as well. I mean, obviously they noticed it, but they noticed it and said that's because these are the original vowels. And so why put the vowels of Adonai in that word? You have to preserve the original vowels. Right? You don't have to, but that's at least what the scribes did. That's the claim. That predates me by many, many years. I found a rabbi in the 14th century who said that, so it's like 600 years. Well, great minds think alike. So I rediscovered something apparently that was well known, at least in certain circles. And to me, that's great, right? That doesn't diminish my discovery. And here's the funniest thing ever. I'll have people who say, Nehemia, what you're saying is complete nonsense and it's impossible. And the very same people will say, but this is obvious. And so therefore you didn't discover anything. Fine, I didn't discover a thing. I accept it. But it is obvious. It's obvious once you take into account certain pieces of information and data, right? So it's not obvious, right? But okay, but other people said it before me. So all of that is to say that currently the best evidence I have is that the name is Jehovah. Could it be something else? Could it be Yuhu Vuhu? And people think I'm joking when I say that I'm not. I found Kabbalistic texts that have the vowels Yuhu Vuhu, literally. Now, they don't say that it was ever pronounced that way. What they say is that when you say the name Adonai, you should be thinking in your mind of these other vowels, right? It's something called kavanot, or the sort of meditations, right? So they don't actually say that's how it was at one time pronounced. The people who say it was at one time pronounced say it's Jehovah, and there's other pronunciations as well. I mentioned Rabbi Ibn Ezra, who said it was Yehiveh. Okay, so there's stronger evidence from Jewish sources that it was Yehiveh than that it's Yahweh. There's not a single Jewish source anywhere in the course of Jewish history that I know of, and if somebody wants to show me differently, where it's the vowels of Yahweh. I actually did find a Kabbalistic work, I think, where it's Yahweh. But again, they're talking about meditations, not how it was pronounced.
So where does Yahweh come from? Can you explain the connection to Gesenius and how he popularized that type of concept?
Yeah, so it's actually unbelievable. So it's under the category of you can't make this stuff up. And you have to also see it to believe it. So I encourage people to do their own research. So Gesenius was one of the great grammarians of Hebrew of all time, really. And Gesenius, he was a German, was not Jewish. He wrote what today is considered the definitive grammar of biblical Hebrew. And any grammar that isn't his was based on his. Like, for example, I mentioned Samuel David Luzzatto. He mentions Gesenius all the time. And he was a rabbi. He didn't always agree with Gesenius. But he was the great scholar. In fact, today, one of the most common dictionaries of biblical Hebrew used by scholars is called Brown Driver Briggs, or BDB. And that's based on Gesenius's dictionary. Okay. Right, if you read the full title, which is like several sentences long, it was based on one version of the German dictionary of Gesenius. So Gesenius says, in one version, not in all of them, meaning his final conclusion was something different, but you can see his thought process. He says that, and I haven't looked at this in a few years, so I hope I'm getting this right. If not, go look what I said on my website, nehemiaswall.com, because that's probably correct. So Gesenius says something to the effect of that he's coming up with this idea that, so let's back up. There's something called comparative linguistics, where scholars noticed that different languages are related. And one of the largest families, and by largest I don't mean by speakers, but one of the most widespread families of languages is called Indo-European languages. And this was actually discovered by this guy. I want to say he was in Vienna or someplace like that. And he had exchange students, or students who were from India. He was surprised to find out that there are words in ancient Indian languages that are the same word for the same thing in European languages. In Latin, for example. And he said, how can that be? Oh, there's coincidences in languages, right? Coincidences absolutely happen. But there were too many for it to be a coincidence. So they realized that all of the Indo-European languages have a common root. And at one time, they were probably a single language. And if you want to say that was just after the flood, okay, whatever. Or just after God mixed up the languages, the Tower of Babel. At that time, French didn't exist, and German didn't exist, and Sanskrit didn't exist, but there was an Indo-European mother language that later, meaning not that much later, evolved into different languages, right? That would be the faith explanation, right? Okay, so why do I mention that? So there was this idea at the time that just as all the languages came from one thing, all the gods at one time must have come from a common source. That was the idea that they had in European academic secular scholarship. And so, and if you want to say not just the whole world, like maybe in China they had different gods, but all over the Mediterranean they must have had some common deities that evolved with different names and different attributes, right? That was where Gesenius was coming from. And he proposes that Yud-He-Vav-He is related to the name for Jupiter. He's saying that Gesenius at one time thought that. And how could it be related to Jupiter? There's no pa in it, there's no ta in it, there's no ra. Well, Jupiter is actually Yoepater, which is Father Yahweh, or Yahweh, depending how you pronounce ancient Latin. So pater is father. So if you strip out that he's the father of all the gods, right? That's what they believed. Then you're left with Yahweh or Yahweh in one of the forms, by the way. There's different forms in Latin. I won't go into that. People can look it up. And one of them, he said, okay, that has to be connected to Yud-He-Vav-He, because originally the Vav was a W, and we can talk about that if you want. And so if it's something, well, we don't know what the vowels are because Jews pronounce it as Adonai, so the vowels have been lost. That's what he said. That's what they thought. That's what most scholars still think. Therefore, if they have the same consonants, yo, then they must have the same vowels. So he patterned one of his pieces of evidence, not the only one, was that Yud-He-Vav-He would be pronounced the same as one of the forms of Jupiter as Yahweh. Now, later he had different arguments and different reasons for saying that, but you can see what his thought process was, right? He essentially wanted it to be Yahweh and was looking for different pieces of evidence to support it. And one of those is he was patterning it after Jupiter in Latin. So,
wow.
Yeah,
that's
pretty shocking. It's shocking that he would be thinking, well, if we want to understand the God of Israel, we have to pattern our understanding after other ancient religions. And look, that's a common thought in academia today, that, you know, later the religion of Israel evolved and they became monotheists, and originally they believed in many gods. And if we want to understand, let's say, the beginning chapter of Isaiah before chapter 40, because there your theory falls apart, so you have to say this is the second Isaiah. But if you want to understand Isaiah chapters 1 through, I want to say 37, because I think 38 and 39 is the story of Sancherib, if memory serves me. But if you want to understand the first 37 chapters, you got to understand them as polytheists. And, okay, that requires an assumption. Well, the first assumption it requires is that the Hebrew Bible doesn't have a uniform view of the deity, right? And I, for theological reasons, reject that. And if you want to say academically for, so they'll say that's my dogma. Okay, I accept that, fine. That my working assumption is that the Tanakh, it had at least an understanding of God that was uniform. And if you want to say you don't believe that, I think the burden of proof is on you, because I'm saying it's a faith statement, right? If you want to make a non-faith statement, what's your evidence? And their evidence requires them to, I call it gerrymandering the Bible. So they'll say, well, yeah, in Deuteronomy, you have the idea of one God. So that was later. right? And in some particular psalm, there's an idea of only one deity. So that was later, right?
Mm-hmm.
So everything that supports the idea of monotheism in the earliest period of, let's say, of ancient Israel, well, that was later. And all the early stuff is the stuff that doesn't support it. Like, for example, when it says in Deuteronomy that God is Jehovah is Adonai Adonim ve'Elohei Elohim. He's the Lord of Lords and the God of Gods, which in Hebrew means like Song of Songs. What does Song of Songs mean? So that's what the Hebrew version of. In English, we have what's called the superlative. So you have, big, bigger, biggest. So biggest is the superlative. The way Hebrew expresses the superlative is by saying Song of Songs. The greatest song. God of Gods is the greatest God. And they'll say, see, there's more than one God. He's just the greatest of them. That's a facepalm moment. I'm sorry. Muslims on a daily basis say Allah is the greatest. Are you saying Muslims today in the 21st century believe there's multiple gods? Well, I'd love to see them dare publish that the Prophet of Islam believed there were multiple gods when he formulated that prayer. Please, I dare you, publish that in an academic journal. Good luck.
So I'm just going to butt in there and just look at this. This is a transcription of...
It's a translation.
Yes, into the English by Tregegels of Gesenius's work, where he talks about Jovis and Jupiter. But he actually mentions Gesenius afterwards thoroughly retracted this.
Okay.
He came up with...
Okay. And by the way, what's in brackets is from the translator.
Yes.
If you look at the original, which I don't remember if it's Latin or German.
I think it's German, yeah.
Okay, so you have to ignore what's in brackets if you want to know what Gesenius wrote. Right? So Gesenius wrote, beautiful, I love you brought this. To give my own opinion, I suppose this word to be one of the most remote antiquity. Right? So this is his thought process. In the remote antiquity, you had this big super tribe which spoke the ancestor not only of Indo-European languages, but also Semitic languages. So this is really remote antiquity, right? And he's not probably right. According to the Torah, that's right. Meaning the part that there was a language that predates all the languages today, right? Isn't that beautiful? He thought that, but he thought that for secular reasons, right? Meaning he thought all of the languages of the world evolved out of a common language. All right, I don't know if that's true or not from a secular perspective. But that's what he means by remote antiquity. Perhaps of the same origin as Jovis, Jupiter. And what do you mean Jovis? Jovis sounds nothing like it. Because Jovis and Jove is what one of the forms was Jove, and then Jupiter, which is Father You or Yoa, and transferred from the Egyptians to the Hebrews.
Sorry.
Right. So look, this is an idea in which still exists and is often valid. Not this idea, but the general idea is what's called diffusionism. Now, I don't know if you have this in Australia, but we have the woke crowd who says that's cultural appropriation. If I eat a taco, which is really funny because in Mexico they don't eat tacos. That's something that was invented in Texas. It's called Tex-Mex, actually. So much for cultural appropriation. But the idea of cultural appropriation is that each culture has these things that belong to them, and other cultures aren't allowed to use them. That's not how culture works. The way culture really works is diffusionism. There's an idea in one culture, and it diffuses, it spreads out to other cultures. And all cultures today are based on diffusionism from previous cultures, right? There is, nobody today has the original human culture. That's not a thing. Or even the culture your ancestors had 2,000 years ago, right? Even Judaism today has evolved, and there's a Jewish culture that exists outside the Tanakh, and certainly outside of even rabbinical literature. It's a culture that exists today that's been influenced by other cultures, and other cultures were influenced by it. That's how culture works, right? So that basic idea isn't wrong. But now he's applying it to the name of the God of Israel. He says, compare what has been said above as to the use of the name of the Egyptian gems, right? Because they're Egyptian gems that have Yahweh, right? So there's magical, when I see gems, I won't go into it. There's basically ancient Egyptian magical sources that have the name Yahweh. And here he's saying something which is almost certainly wrong, that the Egyptians gave that name to the Israelites. What we know today, which I don't think he was aware of, is that Egyptian magic was based on Jewish magic. And you might say, Jewish magic? Jewish magic doesn't exist. It's not supposed to exist. So here we have to go back to their ancient Israel having multiple gods. Ancient Israel did have multiple gods, and the prophets rebuked them for it. Right? Jeremiah says the number of your cities is the number of your gods, O Judah. Right? So if you say, well, ancient Israel had multiple gods, and the idea of one God is a later development. Well, not if you believe the prophets. If you don't believe the prophets, fine, okay. If you believe the prophets, there was only one God, and if you had more than one God, you were a sinner. Right? So what they're really saying, these secular scholars, is that we believe the people the prophets were rebuking was the original authentic religion of Jehovah, of Yahweh. Wow, that's stunning.
And so it seems that the name Yahweh comes from Jove, which is Jupiter.
Right. So the Latins didn't pronounce it Jove; they pronounced it Yahweh.
Wow.
Yeah, as far as I know, that's what I've been told by Latin experts. I'm not at all a Latin expert. I know less Latin than I do Greek.
and so you got multitudes of people around the world calling out the name of Yahweh or Jupiter in churches around the world. And what should people do with this information that you've just given right now?
Well, so here I want to be sensitive and careful. I think the people who are calling on Yahweh, most of them, they're not intending to be calling on Jupiter. Right? So does that matter? That's a theological question that I can answer for myself. I can't answer for them. Psalm 44 talks about something even more extreme, or maybe it's talking prophetically about this. Can we look at Psalm 44? Do you have that in your... Oh, bring it in the King James. Let's see what it says. I don't know what it says.
Psalm 44, 16:11.
So it's going to be... Ooh. So the 16:11, I discovered this shockingly, that the 16:11 isn't the same as what you find today as the King James. That was surprising to me. Like, for example, I started to say this before, people make a big deal of the difference between Jehovah and Jehovah, but in one place in the King James, it actually has Jehovah with an I.
Oh, okay.
In the English.
Jehovah, or...
What's that?
Was that Jehovah or Jehovah?
No, Jehovah. Yeah, sorry, Jehovah.
Okay.
Meaning whether you pronounce it Jehovah or Jehovah, that the King James doesn't tell you that, right? There's no accent markers in English like there are in Hebrew. I don't think there are. Meaning I'm not aware of that being in the King James. But
I've just made this high resolution, so
nice.
Hopefully it doesn't.
So what is your source for this? Okay, I don't know this one. So the one I usually use is the University of Pennsylvania, which has a scan of, which I hope is actually the 1611. They claim it is.
Yeah, this one here is definitely the 1611. It's just going to take a little while for it to load up, I think. I might go back, actually. It's a little bit too high definition.
Yeah, I don't know if we need it on super high. So let's go actually to the next. Oh, is this Psalm 44? Yes, it is. Oh, look at those 4 eyes. I love it. So let's go to the next page, please. So 44, scroll down a little bit more. So there it is, verse 20. I think in Hebrew it's 21. If we have forgotten the name of our God or stretched out our hands to a strange God, shall not God search this out? For he knoweth the secrets of the heart. So what it's saying here, and the context here is they've been scattered among the nations, right? This is exile. Right, so this is a psalm that David didn't write because it's describing exile as a reality, past tense thing. Well, at least in my view. So, so this idea that they inadvertently called on the name of the wrong God, and God still is going to look in their heart. Isn't that beautiful?
Wow. So
if somebody says Yahweh and they genuinely think that is how the name Yud-Heh-Vav-Heh was pronounced, I mean, I say work it out for yourself in fear and trembling with prayer and study before the creator of the universe. But this would seem to indicate that God, if that is authentic, God will accept that. Even if you call out Jupiter in your ignorance and think that is the original name of God, of the God of the Hebrew Bible, of the Ten Commandments, then it sounds like God will accept that. So he's much more merciful than we are.
Yeah.
He's much more understanding than we are. Now, I still think you should try to find out the truth, the best of your ability, and do the best you can. Right? So this is something I'll hear from Christian pastors, and they'll say not about this. They'll talk about other things. They'll say, and not all Christian pastors, most, in fact, I would say probably not. But I have heard this, that certain doctrines they know not to be true, they'll say, well, it doesn't affect salvation. I don't want to confuse the people in the pews. Wait, so you're doing things that you know aren't true, and you're okay with that because it doesn't affect salvation. So that's like, didn't Paul talk about eating from the food of the sacrifice, things sacrificed to idols? He talks about if you don't know if it's sacrificed to idols, okay, then don't offend your conscience. But if you know it's sacrificed to idols, I don't think anybody in the New Testament said that was okay. So if you don't know any better, you don't know any better, right?
Yeah.
Or if there's any information you don't know, right?
So just so on the flip side, what is the etymology of Jehovah?
Okay, so here is something where within a Jewish context, let's say, outside of the academic context, what I'm about to say is not even controversial. This is so common knowledge that I've been criticized. Why would you pretend this is your discovery when this is so obvious? And I haven't, right? If you actually listen to what I say. This is so obvious in the Jewish context that the etymology of the name Jehovah, or whether you pronounce it Jehovah or Yahweh, really doesn't affect this part of it, is the three forms of the Hebrew verb hayahoveh, he was, he is, he will be. Now, in the academic context, the explanation of Jehovah or Yahweh is he that causes to be. And that's purely an invention of academics. There's no Jewish source I'm aware of that says that. And what do I mean by that? This notion, this idea that God's name means he that was, he that is, he that will be, is widespread, is ubiquitous. I like that word ubiquitous, meaning it's found everywhere in Jewish sources. And the idea that it means he that causes to be, that comes out of Christian / secular, really more secular than Christian theology, right? It's this idea that the name of God must mean creator. And so how do you say creator in Hebrew? Well, boreh. Okay, well, that has nothing to do with Yud-Heh-Vav-Heh. All right, well, what if we change the vowels to Yahweh? It's he that causes to be. Oh, okay. Now, there's a grammatical problem with that. Remember I mentioned the impossible hybrid? So leave out hybrid. Let's talk about impossible for a second. In the entire history of the Hebrew language, so I got to back up here a bit. So Hebrew has 7 verbal conjugations. And if you change the vowels and sometimes prefixes and suffixes and infixes, it changes the meaning and it transforms the transforms the verb into another conjugation, and it changes the meaning. So the very same word that means he will be can mean he that causes to be by changing the vowels. However, not every, and I know this is very advanced and complicated, so guys, bear with me. Not every Hebrew verb exists in all 7 conjugations. In fact, you'd be hard-pressed to find a single verb that exists in all 7 conjugations. So much so that grammarians use artificial made-up words because you don't have a word that in practice exists in all 7 conjugations. And all of that's to say, Yahweh, or Yahweh in their pronunciation, is the he-feel form of the verb, which doesn't exist in the entire history of the Hebrew language. Now, I'm going to be really accurate. It does exist once in a poem from the 9th or 10th century, and it doesn't appear as Yahweh. But that's a bit more complicated. So in other words, Yahweh doesn't exist in the Hebrew language. It's a made-up scholarly academic form. It's a speculative form of something that may have at one time existed but doesn't anymore. That's the better way to describe it, right? So I can point in the history of the Hebrew language of what's called the Kal conjugation. That's spelled usually Q-A-L, Kal conjugation. And that's the simple conjugation for the name, for the word to be, that exists all over the place. And then the explanation that Jews have come up with long before me is that the name is he was, he is, he will be. And I actually have a source here from a presentation I did a few years back that I'm going to read to you. I can. Am I able to share?
Yeah, try it. If you just fiddle around for a little bit,
Good luck. Just try it. Okay, no, I'm kidding. So share screen. Screen sharing is easiest with 2 monitors. Well, I don't really have 2 monitors. I sort of do, but not really.
I'll just try and change some of these settings. So
your browser has blocked your screen. I'll just read it to you.
Okay.
So this is a rabbi named Rabbi Yosef Bechor Shor. And I want to say he's from the 12th or 13th century, but I'm going to Google it because I don't remember off the top. Oh, he's 12th century France. Okay. Oh, he was one of the disciples of the famous Rashi. All right. And he says in his commentary in Exodus 3:14, he's commenting on, I wish I could show this. I'm a kind of person who needs to see stuff.
Yeah.
I think it's worth seeing. So let's see. Let's try it again. So share screen. Share screen. Oh, wait. It wants me to block it. I don't want to block it. I want it to allow. SteamYard Studio. Oh, there it is. Allow. Am I sharing?
Yes. Add to stage.
Can you see this slide that I have in my little slideshow with my little? Do you see that or no?
I'll just fiddle around. I've got like.
Oh no, I'm sharing Firefox. Sorry. Okay, so let's stop sharing Firefox. Yeah, I've never used this software before.
No, that's fine.
When share screen, select. Oh, here it is. Sharing my PowerPoint. All right, beautiful. Can you see my PowerPoint now?
I'll just go through. Oh yes, here we go. Add to stage. Yes.
Oh, there it is. Okay, so it says. This is Rabbi Yosef Bechor Shor from the 12th century France, and he's commenting on Exodus 3:14. Now, you could disagree with Rabbi Yosef Bechor Shor, but I would love to see the traditional Jewish sources that show that it's Yahweh, that it's he that causes to be, that it's a verb that means he that causes to be. He says, Ehyeh shel ehyeh, that's I am that I am, or literally, I will, not literally, but you could translate it as I will be that which I will be. He says, and remember, that's I am that I am in most English translations, is the explanation of the unique 4-letter name written throughout the Torah, meaning Yud-Heh-Vav-Heh. For the Holy One, blessed be he, was without beginning, and he will be without end. This is the meaning of the name. Hoveh, he is, and Hayah, he was, and Yehyeh, he will be. So, you could say that this is wrong, but you can't say this is just some crazy theory that I came up with. This has been around for, this guy's from the 12th century. So I want to say that's 800 years ago, but my math is very bad. Right. So let's say he's around 1175. Yeah, that's 900 years ago. Wow. All right.
Wow.
So 900 years ago, about 850, whatever. Jews were already saying that the name means he was, he is, and he will be. Now, I have earlier sources that I could share with you, but the bottom line is that this idea of he was, he is, he will be is something that's all over the place in Jewish sources. And here he just explains it within the context of I am that I am. And here what he's dealing with is there's this strange thing. In Exodus 3:14, God says, Ehyeh, asher ehyeh, I will be, or I am that which I am. And he says, tell them Ehyeh sent me. Ehyeh has sent me. So, and then he said, and it says, and Jehovah said, and God said further to Moses, and then he says his name, Jehovah, and he says, this is my name forever. This is my name from generation to generation. So is it Ehyeh or is it Jehovah? Now here we have to talk about what a name is, right? Because in later Jewish thought, in Jewish philosophy, you could say that a name is a title as well, right? So you could say Elohim is his name, And you could say Adonai is his name, and you could say El Shaddai is his name. But in the Tanakh, his name is only Yehovah, sometimes with attributes added to it, right? It'll be like Yehovah of hosts. But that core Yehovah, that is his name. And the others are called in Hebrew kinui, which is something like a nickname, right? Or you could say a pen name, right? So in modern English, right? So he has titles, or we'd say titles, I suppose. God has many titles and beautiful titles, but he only has one name, one Shem, and that's Yud He Vav He Yehovah. In the Tanakh, in later times, he has many names, which are really just titles and names mixed as if they're the same thing. So when he says, "This is my name forever," this is my mention, is what it actually says in the Hebrew, from generation to generation. And he says his name is Yud He Vav He. Well, what is it? Is it Ehyeh or Yehovah or Yahweh, right? However you pronounce the Yud He Vav He, right? That doesn't really change this part of it. So the explanation of the name is Ehyeh, I will be. And then he says it has a verb that isn't a simple verb, right? It's not a simple verb. There is no verb in the Hebrew language, let's say in that form of the verb. There's a PL, right? We don't have to get into that. But Yud He Vav He is not a simple verb here from Ehyeh. If it's in the same format as Ehyeh, then it's a combination of three verbs. Hayahoveh, yeah, he was, he is, he will be. And I have no doubt in my mind that in the book of Revelation, when it describes this figure, and we can talk about what that figure is, as he was, he is, he will be, that it's the same explanation as Rabbi Yosef Bechor Shor gave in the 12th century. And it's kind of hard to say that Rabbi Yosef Bechor Shor, lived in France in the 12th century, was echoing Christian doctrine, which in his world was Catholic doctrine, because this is a time when Jews and Christians were at loggerheads, right? Certainly about the explanation and nature of God. There's no way a Jew is going to accept something a Christian said. Right? If anything, they'll go out of their way to say something different. So if he's saying this is drawing from Jewish sources. And I could show you what some of those Jewish sources are. If we have time to go into that. But
yeah, that's really interesting. So would I be correct with this little picture that I've made here? And this is from your work. I've just sort of spelled it out. I
think that's from the King James version.
Well, absolutely.
That's the 1611 printing, if I'm not mistaken. Right?
Oh, I thought it was Hebrew. No.
No. All right.
So I've written the Hebrew here. He will be, he is, and he was. Would that be the correct etymology of the next verse where it has Jehovah?
Yeah. So here's what Hebrew. So we have to. First of all, you have the word in the upper left, Yehiyah. That's the font is backwards, right? So the Yud should be on the far right of the word, not the far left.
Yes. Okay.
It's funny. I had a academic journal article where I had this exact problem. I wrote it correctly, and when they went to typeset it, it came out backwards. And they were able to fix it actually, but it had already been published with the mistake, and they were able to go back and change it incredibly. So that this thing happens a lot. So So we have to understand that Hebrew names are often short sentences, and there's something that have been called MNDs, which stands for Midrashic Name Derivations. And and I didn't come up with that. A scholar at Bar-Ilan University, whose name at the moment escapes me, he came up with that. But he's just defining something that was well known in Judaism for thousands of years, which is that the names in the Bible aren't necessarily grammatical derivations. And what I mean by that is that that there are numerous names. I don't even know if it's hundreds or what the exact number is. There are names where the name is connected to the meaning of a sentence. So, for example, Judah, right? I'm a Jew. Where does Jew come from? Judah. Jew comes from Yehovah Odeh. I will thank Yehovah. But if I was going to say Yehovah, I will thank Yehovah, or I will praise Yehovah, could mean as well. If I was going to say I will praise or I will thank Yehovah in a sentence, isn't that interesting? And it really also could mean I will confess Yehovah, which how interesting that Jews don't speak the name usually, because the name Jew means I will confess Yehovah. So, but if I was to say I will confess or I will thank or I will praise Yehovah in a sentence, I would say Odeh Yehovah or Yehovah Odeh, I wouldn't say Yehudah, right? So how do I get from Judah to I will thank Yehovah? Well, I've got to, I'll say mush things. I got to modify things to put it into a name. Or Abraham, he's the father of many nations. But father of many nations isn't Avraham. Doesn't even sound a little bit like Avraham, right? Av Hamon Goyim is the phrase, father of many nations. By the way, there's that word Goyim, which Christians think is or some people think is a slur. Well, no. Israel and the peoples related to it are called Goyim, nations. So father of many nations, Av Hamon Goyim. But it's Avraham. Shouldn't it be Avham Goy or something? So that's what this scholar Bar-Ilan called MNDs, Midrashic name derivations, right? So sometimes the name sounds like the other word, and it's good enough that it sounds like it. It doesn't have to be grammatically derived from it. But in this passage, we have a question. What does Eheyeh, I am, have? What on earth does it have to do with Yehovah? And the answer there is what Rav Yosef Bechor Shor said. It's giving you the explanation of the name. So this is an MND, a Midrashic name derivation. And it's I prefer to call them BNDs, biblical name derivations, but whatever. Let's not split hairs. So this name derivation, the first verse 14 is the derivation of verse 15. And that makes perfect sense in Hebrew. We see it all the time, dozens or hundreds of times. Right? There's a famous character in Chronicles called Jabez in English. Jabez is from the Hebrew Ya'abetz. And it says because he was born Be'otzev, in sadness. And what actually is done there in Chronicles is the two of the letters in the name are switched. So you can't say that's a grammatical derivation. Right? It's a word that sounds like the other word. So in this case, Eheyeh, number one sounds like Yud-Heh-Vav-Heh, however you pronounce that name. And number two very clearly seems to be derived from the same root. Right, so Hebrew and all Semitic languages are based on three-letter roots. That's one of the central principles of Semitic linguistics. Right, so it's true of Hebrew, Aramaic, Arabic, Gaz, Akkadian. All the Semitic languages are based on three-letter roots. There are some exceptions. And they have excuses for the exceptions, the linguists. But the three-letter root here is the letters Hey Yud Hey or Hey Vav Hey. And I say or because sometimes it functions as if the root is Hey Yud Hey, and sometimes it functions as if the root is Hey Vav Hey. Right? So the past tense is Haya, which is Hey Yud Hey, but the present is Hoveh Hey Vav Hey. And then the future is Yihiyeh, which has Hey Yud Hey with a prefix. So Eheyeh is the prefixed form I will be, and it has Hey Yud Hey. So how do we get he is? Exodus 3:14 says nothing about he is or he was. It only says about I will be. So the Yud prefix is he will. So then it should be Yihiyeh, what you have there but backwards, right in the upper left. Right, so it's Yud Hey. But then when the name we have Yud Hey Vav Hey. So where'd the Vav come? The Vav had to come from the present tense form. I guess you could say it was from the imperative form, but nobody says that I'm aware of. So Jewish sources by and large agree that the name derives from he was, he is, he will be. And where they're not just making that up out of the thin air. Where they're getting that is from comparing Exodus 3:14 and 3:15 and saying, wait a minute, Eheyeh is the future form, but with a different prefix. Where'd the Vav come from? The Vav came from the present tense Hoveh. That's where they're getting it from.
Wow. That's very interesting. And that's, I guess it's been amazing to me to see that in the book of Revelation. So I'll just get this verse up from my website where it has, Thou art righteous, O Lord, which art and wast and shalt be. So it's got the present, the past, the present, and the future. And so this would be the etymology of Jehovah.
I would say it's the explanation. Notice there's a difference between etymology and the name explanation, right? A derivation implies a linguistic process I guess this is linguistic process too, but it's not a derivation. Here's what I could say. Eheyeh, I am, is a derivation of the verb haya, to be, right? And yud he vav he is a derivation from that verb as well, but it's an unusual form of derivation. At least that's how it's explained in Jewish sources, and that it's three different forms. It's a combination that expresses three forms of the Hebrew verb. So you could say that. I don't know. That might be splitting hairs, but that's what I do for a living. I split hairs.
No,
ironic, isn't it? Since I have no hair. So yeah. So I hope that makes sense.
And
so
yes.
So I actually want. Sorry, go ahead. Follow up. Yeah. And then I want to look at Revelation earlier in the book.
Yeah, absolutely. From a Jewish perspective, when you read this and you see it in a Christian context, what do you think the author had in mind when he wrote this? So
that's what I want to get to. Let's look at, and I'm forgetting the verse off the top of my head, but it's the one earlier in Revelation where it says, "Holy, holy, holy." Where?
Yes, Revelation 4:8. I'm pretty sure that is
Revelation 4:8. All right, let me pull this up in my little Bible software here. Revelation 4:8. All right. So yes, we have hagios, 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 which I'm pronouncing the Hebrew University way, not the way Greeks say it today, because they have like a y for the g. So there you go, beautiful. Hagios, hagios, hagios. I don't see that part there. Which is holy, 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 and that's nobody doubts, nobody disputes that this is taken, or it echoes, you could say, right? Meaning, I suppose if you're a believer in the New Testament, you would say this is taken from the revelation John had. But John then saw the same thing that happened in Isaiah 6:3. Let's put it that way. Right?
Yes.
So in other words, John had the same sort of Isaiah 6:3 revelation, where in Isaiah 6:3 it says in Greek, hagios, 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 holy, holy, holy.
Yes.
And what's really interesting, can I share my screen here and show everybody my Greek here?
Yeah, please do.
This is my Bible software accordance. Let me pull up the Hebrew. Okay. So he's in heaven and he's seeing the angels. So we'll do present and we'll do share screen. And then we have to choose, okay. So here's accordance. So can you see that? Oh, can you see that now? There it is. Beautiful. So accordance is my very fancy Bible software.
Okay.
And it says there in the Hebrew, "V'kara ze el ze v'amar," and he called this one to another and said, right, I mean the angels in heaven, Kadosh, 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 holy, 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 Yehovah Tzvaot, Yehovah of hosts, Melo chol haaretz kvodo, the whole earth is filled with his glory. So in Greek we have, and here's the operative words in Greek. Let me see if could you see my mouse here? Do you see my mouse?
I might just try and make it a bit larger.
You what?
I just made it a little bit larger. So, yeah,
okay, beautiful. All right. Oh, so you see what my mouse is hovering over, not my mouse. All right. So it's there hagios. Oh, I love this. So what my software does is it highlights the Hebrew word and the Greek word that parallels the Hebrew. So we have kadosh, hagios, kadosh, hagios, kadosh, hagios, holy, holy, holy. And then it's kurios, which is Lord, or Kyrios in modern Greek pronunciation. And then it's Tsevaot, of hosts. But the Greek doesn't say of hosts. It says Savaoth, or Sabaoth in, let's say, the classical pronunciation, something like that. Sabaoth. Sabaoth. So what's going on here? So there's no question whatsoever this comes from a Hebrew phrase, because it uses a Hebrew phrase. Right? You don't have to guess. There's a Hebrew phrase right there in the Greek. So it's transcribing the Hebrew word Tsevaot of hosts. And it's interesting, what does of hosts mean, right? That's a different discussion. Is it the hosts of heaven, or the hosts of Israel, or the angels? The hosts of heaven as in the stars, right? It's not clear. But in any event, so it's Kurios Sabaoth, the Lord of hosts, which is the translation of Yehovah of hosts. So in the original Hebrew, even if you read it as Lord, it says Yud He Vav He. Right? In other words, this word is what Jews today, when they read this as Adonai. Adonai Tsevaot. And so maybe that's why it was translated as Kurios Savaoth, because that was the way it was read by Jews. But the letters, the 4 letters are there in the original Hebrew. And maybe that's what was written in the original source of the book of Revelation, or even in the Greek source it could have been written. I don't know. But in any event, it's definitely based on this phrase. And so why is that important? So it's important because when we look at in the Greek of Revelation, so now let's go back to the Greek of Revelation. It says Kurios, Hotheos, Hopantokrator. So it's Lord, the God, the Almighty. And Pantokrator is the standard translation in Greek for Tsevaot.
Wow.
Right? So we've already learned something fascinating. It's not that John sat down with the book of Revelation, it's not that John of Patmos, that's more accurate. So John of Patmos didn't sit down with the Greek translation of the Tanakh, the Septuagint that we have today, and then say, I'm going to lift this verse and put it in my book. That didn't happen. We know that didn't happen because he doesn't just change Jehovah to Kurios. And by the way, the Septuagint does have Kurios. But he has Hopantokrator as the translation of Tsevaot, of hosts, where the Septuagint has just Tsevaot in the Greek letters.
Wow.
Right? So John is not getting this direct from the Septuagint, at least as it's come down to us today in our standard Septuagint version. Right? So it could be the Septuagint was different in the 1st century when John wrote this. Or it could be that, I guess from a faith perspective, you could say the angel didn't pick up the book of the Septuagint from the 21st century or from the 4th century and read out of it. But the angel translated into, and here's a question, I don't know what you believe. Do you believe the angel was speaking to, or when John had this revelation, however you believed it happened?
I believe
in Greek.
I believe it was spoken to him in Hebrew because he was a native Hebrew, and I believe in Edenics that Hebrew was the first original language on earth. Yeah,
I believe that too. Although I would say the Hebrew we have today isn't the Hebrew. I mean, even the Hebrew of the Torah may not be the Hebrew of Adam and Eve, because we have words that come from Egyptian. Certainly in the language of Adam and Eve, there wasn't the word Pharaoh or Ahu, which is the Egyptian word for papyrus or reeds. We translate it, but it's really papyrus, right? So presumably he didn't have those words. But yeah, some form of Proto-Hebrew, I believe, existed in, but that's a faith statement. That's fine. Okay, so in any event, however the revelation happened, or however John wrote this, whatever you believe about it, it's not based directly on our version of the Septuagint, because there are differences, Pantokrator instead of Sabaoth. So then he adds another thing. And that other thing is, and I'll let you present it because that's your expertise, which is the Textus Receptus. Because the Textus Receptus has this. Actually, the Nestle Aland has it too, so it's not there. It's not different. In other verses, it's different. So there, it doesn't really matter. So what do you have there in the Greek?
I'll just share screen. There we go. I just thought I'd add too that there is a chiastic structure to these 5. I call them the triadic declarations, where the first one has the present, the past, and the future, or the first 2 have that. The middle one has the past, the present, and the future, and then the final 2 has the present, past, and then future. So it's quite an interesting little study to get into. But just back up to the actual verse, it has, and I heard the angel of the water say, thou art righteous, O Lord. So it's interesting, it has O Lord, which in Hebrew would be Jehovah. Every time this triadic declaration appears in the book of Revelation, the word Jehovah, or Kurios in the Greek, appears, except for the first time when John's sort of explaining himself in a bit of an introduction. but whenever it's spoken by Jesus or the angels or the 24 elders, they say Lord, then they sort of expand and say who was and is to come, or who was and is and shall be. It's like they're saying the word and then they're explaining the etymology, as I mentioned before, or an explanation of what that means. And they also use Pantocrator in every one of those places as well, which is quite interesting.
So the reason Revelation 4 is so important from my perspective is that I don't need to guess and say that originally it said there Jehovah. I have the book of Isaiah to know that when you have holy, 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 blank, Pantocrator, that the word blank is Jehovah. That's right. That's right there, and that's what's so beautiful to me about it, right? Because otherwise, I think you're probably right. I don't know about the chiastic structure, but the other part, I think you're probably right that this was a term to refer to Jehovah or Jehovah, but in Revelation 4:8, it's unambiguous that it's based on Isaiah 6:3, and I think it's not even disputed. If somebody disputes it, I'd love to hear why. But based on, I mean, it's the same sort of vision that's taking place, right? It's the same revelation. And there, as far, even the Nestle Aland, which I know you don't go by, you go by the Erasmus's Textus Receptus, but even the next Nestle Aland has the same as the Textus Receptus, which is hoen kai hoon kai ho erchomenos, right? So it's he that it's the three forms of the verb, right? So now there it's ho erchomenos, which is to come. But frankly, the difference between there is to come and he will be is not really significant in this context, you know. And somebody may disagree with me, but in Hebrew, you know, you'll say "and it was," and in Indo-European languages, you'll say "and it came to pass." Well, it came where? Where did it come? Right. So it will come to pass. In Hebrew, you say "yihiyeh," it will be. Oh, and which translation is this? This is interesting.
So this is the Elijah Hutter 1599 Dodecaglot, which is a 12-language Bible. Now, he worked on a Hebrew New Testament. And so this is where I've underlined the green with green here, the name of Jehovah. And then it's got the triadic declaration. And so in 1:4, it doesn't have the name of Jehovah. In 1:8, it does. In 4:8, it has Jehovah and the triadic declaration. Whoops, I've gone a bit far there. 11:17, it has that, and then Revelation 16:5. I'm not sure where that picture went. I think I might be getting them a bit muddled, but the first one doesn't have the name of Jehovah, but the rest do. They all have Jehovah, which is in green here, and the triadic declaration, or the past, the present, and the future, or is to come, or shall be, with the red underlined. So I thought you might find that interesting.
Yeah, that's interesting. What's interesting about it is someone is translating the Greek back into Hebrew, or I don't know what he used. Did he use the Greek or the Latin? But anyway, he's going back into Hebrew with whatever European language he's using, and he's coming to what seems pretty obvious to me, which is, and I don't know. I'm really curious. Is there someone who disputes this in Christian studies? I don't know the answer to that, but it seems patently obvious that this is this idea of he is, he was, he will be, or in different orders. Right? You showed that. I love that chiastic structure. I hadn't noticed that. I mean, I noticed they were in different orders, but I hadn't noticed it was a chiastic structure. That's a thing that you'll find in Hebrew poetry, but also in Hebrew writing, where it's A, B, C, CBA. Right, my favorite. Like you have different elements that repeat themselves, and when they're repeated, they're in the reverse order. So you have shofech dama adam ba adam damoy shofech. He who sheds the blood of man, by man his blood shall be shed.
Wow.
Right, and so that's A, B, C, CBA. Right, so that's an ancient thing. Right, that's everybody agrees, even secular scholars. So that's a really early thing. That phrase, it's from Genesis chapter 9, somewhere around there. Right? Just poetically, it's a very early form, and it's chiastic. So let me show you something I have here, which is so you have something called Targum Pseudo-Jonathan. And it's called Pseudo-Jonathan because it was attributed to a man named Jonathan, the son of Uzziel, who translated the prophets into Aramaic. Oh, you have it there. Okay. Pseudo-Jonathan is something where they thought it was translated by Jonathan, because it's actually quite funny why. And later they realized this isn't Jonathan, because Jonathan has certain phrases he uses, and this is a translation of the Torah, and Jonathan only translated the prophets. So it's called Pseudo-Jonathan. It's interesting. What was it originally? So in the Hebrew manuscripts, apparently it said Tav Yud, which is an acronym, which they mistook to be Targum Yonatan, Targum Jonathan. And now they say, oh, that was Targum Yerushalmi, the Jerusalem Targum. Right? So this was the Targum they used in the land of Israel. At least that's what whoever wrote the manuscript thought. And then later people misunderstood it and thought it was of Jonathan. So that's what Pseudo-Jonathan means. When is it from? Boy, it's debated. There's a professor at Bar-Ilan University who says it's from the 12th century. Other scholars say it may go back to the 1st century. Even the one who says it's from the 12th century says it has earlier sources, because obviously there's earlier things in it. Okay, so Targum Jonathan on Deuteronomy 32, 39 has Ana, and this is in Aramaic, right? So actually we know it. So in Exodus 3:14, it has Ahiyah Shelahiyah, I am that I am. And he could easily translate it that way, but he doesn't. He translates it Anahu dehavena fatid lemihve. I am he that I was and in the future am to be. Right? So what he's doing is he's taking that interpretation that Yosef Bechor Shor put in there in the 12th century. And he's doing this probably in the 1st or 2nd century, right? So this is important because it's the earliest source that I know of, at least, that has it. And we'll look at Philo and Septuagint in a minute. And he is explaining the divine name, Jehovah, as those 3 tenses. And what's interesting is that, in a way, it's ironic that the earliest Jewish source that has this explanation, or that has this, as you call it, triadic. What did you call it? Triad. I like that.
Triadic declaration.
Triadic declaration. All right. I'll call it the tri-tense declaration or something. I don't know. So the earliest reference to this tri-tense declaration is the Book of Revelation, unless Targum Jonathan is earlier in the Book of Revelation, or let's say it's source, right? Meaning Targum Jonathan was based on earlier sources, and it apparently had this tri-tense format or explanation. And so we have now 2 witnesses from around the year 100, whenever you date Targum Jonathan or the Book of Revelation, right? Let's say give or take 20 years, right? I don't really know. I know a lot of that speculation. And then Deuteronomy 32:39 is another one. I don't know if you have that one. You do, okay. It says, see now that I am he, and there is no God with me. That's in the Hebrew, what it has. And in the Pseudo-Jonathan in the Targum, in the Aramaic, it says, see now that I am he that is, and I was, and I am he that in the future am to be. All right, and there's no other God beside me. So it's the same explanation. There's no question that there's some connection between what we have in Revelation, even if we only have it once, right? There's disputes about all 5 of those, right? But even if we only had it once, there's a connection between what's in Revelation and what's in Targum Pseudo-Jonathan. And nobody is going to argue, nobody's seriously going to argue, let's put it that way. Maybe I want to say differently. Nobody serious is going to argue that Targum Pseudo-Jonathan was influenced by the Book of Revelation. That's not plausible. So they both have a common source. Now, can you say that Revelation was influenced by Targum Pseudo-Jonathan? Pretty unlikely, right? Chronologically, it doesn't work. So this is an idea that exists in the Jewish world that they're both drawing on, right? And you can say if you want the angels drawing on it or whatever, right? Or it's happening in heaven, and that's what John of Patmos is saying, right? however you want to explain it. Or when it's translated into Greek, they're incorporating this into their translation, right? Or John is translating it that way. I don't know, whatever. But this is an idea that's in Judaism in the first century. That's the takeaway here, and probably before, because generally when these things are quoted, they must have some earlier life. So I think that's quite significant. So I gave a lecture on this at Bar Ilan University, and I don't know if I'm the first, which is where I got my PhD. And what's interesting about Bar Ilan is it's one of only 2 Orthodox Jewish universities in the world, at least that I know of. Maybe there's other ones. Yeshiva University in New York and Bar Ilan University in Ramat Gan, Israel. And I presented on this exact topic. And there I was at Bar Ilan University presenting on the book of Revelation and showing how it has parallels to, at an Orthodox Jewish university, I'm presenting on Revelation and showing how it has a common idea that exists in Targum Pseudo-Jonathan. So,
wow.
Yeah.
So when the rabbis said the name of Jehovah in the temple, did they pronounce the explanation of the name with the I ams? Like, would they have said the name Jehovah and then said, the one who was and is to come? Because I've
that's a good question. I was going to say definitely not, and then something came to mind, which is really interesting. Now you're getting me thinking about something interesting. Am I still sharing my screen? Or?
No, you're not.
Okay. So, meaning what you just said, no, I don't think that's a thing. Or let me put it differently. I don't know that we have evidence for that. Right. So the rabbis talk about the priests, not just the high priest. They talk about the priests in general, pronouncing the name in the temple during the priestly blessing. Then the high priest would do it on Yom Kippur. But the priest would do it daily. So first of all, it wasn't necessarily rabbis, right? Because the high priest generally wasn't a rabbi. But they heard it, right? So did they, when they were discussing what he said, did they say the explanation I am is what you're asking? That's an interesting question that I immediately want to say no, but then something comes to mind that I have to check before I say it in order to be responsible. Let's see. If you want to wait a minute, it's a bit awkward here for those online.
No, that's fine. I'm throwing out some pretty in-depth.
Yeah, that's a good question. I like the question. So, but did they explain it the way you just said it? Definitely not. But is there an allusion to that? That's interesting. All right, I need to do more research here in order to answer this responsibly, unless I get lucky and find what I'm looking for. Let's see. Yeah. So I'm going to have to. Oh no, here it is. I found it. So it's in the Babylonian Talmud. Oh no, it's in the Jerusalem Talmud. Interesting. And it's describing the ceremony that took place on Sukkot. And they would sing, Ana Yehovah Hoshiana, Ana Yehovah Hatzlichana, which is from the Psalm 128:25. And it's, oh Lord, or oh Yehovah, I don't know how they said it in the temple. Say, and the other ones I know because we're told that's how they said it with the actual name. Here maybe they said Lord, I don't know. Meaning at some point maybe they said Yehovah, but in the first century maybe they're saying Lord. So it's oh please, Lord, save, right? And that's where you get Hosanna, by the way, from Psalm 128, from 118:25. So this is something that was recited or sung in the ceremony in the temple. And then it says there's a different opinion, which says no, they didn't just say that. They would say Ani v'hu Hoshiana, I and he, please save. I and he, please save. So instead of oh, please, Hosanna, it was I and he. So what's I and he? Right? So maybe that was Ani Jehovah. I mean, I'm thinking out loud here, right? I'm spitballing. But there you have an I, right? Who's I? Well, nobody thinks I is. And people have suggested this is related to the word Jehovah, right? That's not something new I just came up with. But nobody's been intelligently, in my opinion, been able to explain how. But maybe that's how. Maybe the I there is related to the I am. I don't know, just a thought. Right? That was just, just spitballing, right? So that's in the Jerusalem Talmud, Sukkot chapter 4, and in what's people normally quote the Venice edition. So in the Venice edition, it's folio 54 B, if somebody wants to look that up. But it's also chapter 4, section 3. So anyway, maybe someone will discover something there, how that, or maybe that's a Jehovah. I am and he is. Oh, interesting idea. Yeah, but that's been connected to the Tetragrammaton before, right? That's not new to me.
Okay.
Yeah.
Very interesting. And so maybe just what about the theophoric names? Now, I know that you're a busy guy, and we've already gone for an hour and a half. I could go for
really? Wow.
But I've really enjoyed this. But if I could go forever, I could go for as long as you want. But I'm throwing it in your support and just saying.
All right, let's do a few more top questions. We'll limit it to 2 hours. Since I do everything I need to get to. Yeah.
So what about the theophoric names? The names of Jehovah inside the Benjamin Netanyahu, it seems to have the name Yahoo in the end of that. And
so the rule is there is numerous theophoric names. A theophoric name is where you have the name of another god inside your name. So for example, and let's take I like to start with examples which aren't related to the God of Israel, because that helps us understand what the concept is here, right? There might be some theological significance to the Israelite, or let's say the Jehovah-based theophoric names. So for example, Israel has an enemy in the second temple, or in the first temple period rather, maybe slightly before the first temple indeed, named Hadad Ezer. And Hadad Ezer is the name of the god of the Arameans who live in Damascus. And Ezer means he helps. So Hadad Ezer means Hadad helps. And Hadad was actually probably the name of Baal. Right? Baal means Lord. It wasn't his actual name. And the explanation that scholars have come up with is his actual name was Hadad. And the Canaanites didn't want to say his name. So what they said was Lord. Interesting, by the way. So Hadad Ezer is Lord, is Hadad helps. And we have the same name in Hebrew, except it's not with the god Hadad, it's with our God. And it's Yehoezer. So Yehoezer is Jehovah helps. But the very same name exists with Yeho at the end. And when Yeho's at the end, it's Yahu. So we have Azariah, who is one of the kings of Israel. Is also a prophet named Azariah ben Oded. Right, so that's Azariah in English, right? So Azariah is Azariahu, and it's really the same name as Yehoezer, right? Or it's the same meaning as the name Yehoezer. Yehovah saves. Now, why isn't it Azar Yeho? Why is it Azaryahu? Or why isn't it Yahu Ezer? Because that's not how Hebrew works. It's just not. Right? So Hebrew has this thing where long vowels are shortened when they're distant from the place of the emphasis. I could go into that, but it's a bit complicated. But basically, if you have something that by itself is Yah, as in hallelujah, Yah is its own word in hallelujah in Hebrew. It's written as a separate word. Or we have other instances where Yah is by itself. If it's Yah with the long vowel kamatz, that would be shortened to Yeho at the beginning of a word. Right, that's kind of obvious to people who know Hebrew grammar. Shadal said that in the early 19th century, right? That's no big discovery of mine, right? That's something that the how do I put this? I won't say it because it's obnoxious, so I won't say it. Anyway, let's move on.
So in proving that the name is Jehovah, how do you use the theophoric names to?
Right. So whenever the names begin, let's start with whatever the names end. It's Yahoo. Right, and the emphasis in Hebrew is the Yah. Right, so Hebrew has two places it can put the emphasis. It can put it on the final syllable or second to last syllable. There's no such thing in Hebrew as the main emphasis is on the third to last syllable. That's not a thing in Hebrew. It is in English, right? It happens all the time in English. In fact, English prefers not putting it at the end of a syllable, right? Although it depends on, right? You could change the meaning in Hebrew, or excuse me, you could change the meaning in English by where you put the emphasis, right? So think about the word perfect and perfect. So perfect, the syllable is in the last place, and perfect, it's on the second to last. Now, English doesn't express it as last and second to last, but Hebrew does. It calls it literally above and below, right? Below is the last syllable, and above is the second to last syllable. Right, that's how it uses Aramaic terms for that. So, so those are the two emphases. So my name Nehemia isn't actually Nehemia; it's Nehemiah. Why am I called Nehemia? Because my great grandfather, his native language was Yiddish, and in Yiddish they like to shift the syllable earlier in the word. So in Yiddish it's Nehemia, right? In proper Hebrew it's Nehemiah, right? Let's say in Tiberian Hebrew to be more accurate. Right. All right. So in any event, and there's many names like that. So we'll have modern Jews who are named Rivka, which is Rebecca, but it's not Rivka in the Bible. It's Rivka. Right. So the emphasis is on the Yah in names like Netanyahu. Right. So Netanyahu, it's actually on Netanyahu. Right. If I call him Netanyahu, by the way, in English, this is a major controversy now. Who would have believed whether you call her Kamala or Kamala? Right, that's something that will get you banned from some social media platforms and labeled a racist if you call. I don't even know what the right one is off the top of my head. I'm not even sure, so I'm afraid to say. They're listening. So, but really, Netanyahu is the emphasis is on the Yah, and all the names it's on the Yah. Right? So it's not hallelujah. That's actually wrong in Hebrew. It's hallelujah. Right? So it's on the Yah. There it's actually two words hyphenated, but so it's a bit different. So it's not hyphenated in Netanyahu. It's really one word. And it's really Nehemiah. That's actually my name. Nobody calls me that. I had one professor at University who called me that, Shmaryal Talmud. But nobody else calls me that. Even my father called me Nehemia because that's the Yiddish pronunciation or the Eastern European Jewish pronunciation. In any event, so names tend to be very conservative, even though in modern Hebrew they would say Nehemiah, just like in Tiberian Hebrew, for the name they still say Nehemia. So the point is that the I in Nehemiah is pre-tonal. Right, it's two positions before the emphasized syllable, so it really can't be not in Tiberian Hebrew. It couldn't be Yah. It would be Yah. It would be. It couldn't be. Let's take a Yah name, right? So Yehoezer, right, which is the same as Azar Yahu. It can't be Yahoezer because that's not how Hebrew works. Right, the syllable has to be shortened to, in this case, what's called a shva, and it becomes yeh. Right, that was something that was pointed out by Shadal 150, almost 200 years ago. Actually, I'm looking at the calendar. He wrote that in the 1830s. Right, so this should be pretty obvious. Right, I don't think that part's disputed. Right, I don't know if it is. It's a good question. Does anybody dispute names like Yehoezer or let's say Yehoshua? Yehoshua is a bit different, but it's the same basic principle. Yehoshua. So the emphasis is on Shu and Yehoshua, Joshua. And why isn't it Yahoshua? Because that's not how Hebrew works. right? It's too far from the emphasized syllable to have a long vowel like kamatz, which is the vowel in Netanyahu, right? You wouldn't have it there. So it becomes truncated, or it's called pretonal shortening. In this case, pretonal, I guess, if we want to be really technical. Yeah, so it's going to be a yeh in those names. It has to be. And why wouldn't it be in the name Jehovah when the emphasized syllable is on the va? Now, yeah, go ahead.
So with the name, like, or with the word hallelujah, is Yah like a contracted form of Jehovah?
So there's different explanations of it. One explanation is that it's a contracted. Everyone agrees it's an abbreviated form, right? But how is it abbreviated? So one explanation is that it is just it's the first two letters. Here it's complicated because it could be the first and last letter as well, right? So those are the two explanations, basically.
Okay.
This rabbi I mentioned before, Samuel David Luzzatto, he has an interesting explanation where, but it's complicated. I won't go into it. We only have a few minutes left. So
okay. So I'm just wondering about. I'll just show my screen. Here we go. So in the Hebrew theophoric names, we have names like Jehoiakim, but that's changed to Joachim. So it seems like the EH was removed at some stage. Would this be the first type of form of a nomina sacra type of thing?
No. Why? I don't know what you mean by nomina sacra. I know what it means in New Testament studies. I don't know that it applies here. Okay. Nomina sacra is like where you're writing the word kurios and you write the kappa and the sigma and you put a line over them. Or Kyrie, which is "Oh Lord," and you write the kappa and the epsilon, and you're trying to save space. People have claimed that indicates deity. I'm not convinced of that, because in the early Greek manuscripts, they also have the word Jerusalem as Yota Mu, or something like that. So are you saying Jerusalem is God? And the explanation I've heard from Greek scholars is Jerusalem was a cipher for God. I don't find that very convincing. The name Mary, when it refers to the mother of Jesus, is also nomina sacra sometimes in some manuscripts. So I find that very doubtful. But okay, but who knows? That's not my expertise. So is this nomina sacra? Not exactly. What this is it's a truncation, right? So you have Yocheved, the mother of Moses. Think about that. Before the Torah was given, we have somebody who has this abbreviation. Right, so she's not Yehocheved, which means Jehovah is honorable. I guess it could mean Jehovah is heavy, but probably Jehovah is honorable, or the glory of Jehovah. Jehovah is glorious. That's what Yocheved means. No, it's Yocheved. Yocheved, right? So the emphasis is in the second. It's not Yocheved, by the way. It's Yocheved, right? Or Jokeved, I guess in English, right? The emphasis is in the second last syllable. And you have a further truncation. Now, this truncation is for a different reason, I think. So the letter, you just said H, which is interesting. That's what Australians say. So I'm from Chicago, and we say H.
H, yeah.
And you say house. I don't know. Do you say house or do you say house?
Yes, house.
Okay. What about the things that you cook with? Are those herbs or herbs?
Herbs.
Really? So in America, we say it correctly. We say herbs. And I'm joking about correct because who's to say, right? It's different dialects of English. So in some pronunciations of Hebrew from ancient times, they didn't pronounce the h. And so Yehocheved became Yehocheved, and we had a truncation where it became Yocheved, right? So if you're pronouncing the h as an Australian pronounces it in herb, then the hay will drop. And we have that in lots of places. It's not unique to theophoric names. It's all over the place. Especially where there's a h at the beginning of a word, although not only, or towards the beginning. We have it at the end too. Why am I Nehemia in the Bible, or he is, and the biblical character is Nehemia? Why isn't he like Netanyahu, Nehemyahu? So the answer is it is. we have inscriptions from the First Temple period that were found on these seals. And it's really strange because somehow the Jewish occupation already began in the 7th century BCE or the 6th century BCE. And I'm joking here, right? We have Jewish seals, like somebody would stamp their name into a piece of clay, and we have that little piece of clay. It's called a bulla. It's a seal impression. And we have those from the 6th century BCE or late 7th century BCE from Jerusalem, right? So it shows that there were Jews there in the 7th or 6th century BCE, probably closer to the end of the 7th. And they have the name Nehemiah. Right? Well, why isn't it Nehemiah? So what happened is the name was truncated because they didn't pronounce the hey. And so Nehemiah became Nehemiah, which became Nehemiah. Right? Same thing at the beginning. Yehocheved became Yocheved. And what's interesting is we don't have the form Yehocheved for the mother of Moses. We only have Yocheved. Now we do have Yosef, which is Joseph. And we know that name came from Jehovah. We're told what it means, right? It's Jehovah adds, Jehovah multiplies, Jehovah Yasaf, Yosef. And usually it's Yosef, but we have a place in the Tanakh, in the Hebrew Bible, where it's written Yehosef. Is that in the English? Do you see that? I actually don't know the answer to that.
I think it is in the English. They do have the Jeho and Joe distinction. And I guess that the circles that I'm in, we sort of feel that this was because of the commandments. Don't take the name of the Lord in vain. So some of these names were shortened so that people wouldn't accidentally say the name of Jehovah when they're saying Jehoshaphat or Jehoiakim.
That's nonsense. I'll tell you why that's nonsense. And I don't mean to offend you.
No, that's fine.
If that's your theological view, then I'll respect it. But let me rephrase. I take back its nonsense. Here's why I don't think that's correct. So the Jewish ban on the name, right? So there, and that's debated when that started. We could discuss that, but that'll be another hour. So, but nobody disputes that by a certain period there was a ban on speaking the name, whether it happened in the 3rd century BCE when there's the death of Simon the Just, or maybe a few centuries later, whatever. So there's this time and period where Jews, rabbis decide it's forbidden to speak the name in any context, not just outside the temple. And well, the temple was destroyed, definitely, according to one version. So they say Adonai instead. And today they'll even say Hashem, which is now a further like a mission creep, right? First we say Yehovah is too holy, so we'll say Adonai. And now we say Adonai is too holy outside of prayer, so we'll say Hashem, right? So whenever that happened, but it was certainly in place by the end of the 2nd century CE. That's not disputed, and it really can't. It's hard to dispute that. It never applied to the theophoric names. Never. Even today, there's people with the name Yehoshua. Right? It's a very common name. There's people with the name. I'm trying to think of another one off the top of my head which is a common name, right? I mean, there's people with the name Yehochanan, right? So there's an example. Yehochanan is a common name. Now, Yehochanan in the Tanakh is truncated to Yochanan, but sometimes it's Yehochanan. Now, in modern times, it's very common for people to have the name Yehochanan. So despite the full-blown ban on the name, where there's even a tendency not to say Adonai because it's too holy, right? That mission creep, they'll still say Yeho in a name because nobody thinks that's taking the name of God, right? It's an element of God's name, but it's so common. Obviously, the ban never applied to Yah in Hallelujah. That's why it's so surprising that in the King James they have Lord for Hallelujah, because nobody ever had a ban on that in Judaism, right? That's always been accepted, that's some sort of an abbreviated form, however you explain it, and therefore it's not forbidden because it's only the full form that's forbidden by rabbinical tradition or law. And so the Yeho form, the Yeho element has never been banned. It's not a thing. So now there are people who truncate it, right? There are people who, and this is an interesting thing. I was shocked when I moved to Israel. When I first came to Israel, I was there before I even moved, I was there for a year, and I was in an old pond studying Hebrew. and there were these Jews from Italy, and we were reading something in the weekly Torah portion about the mountain where I still remember it now. It was 1990. That's a long time ago. And we were reading something from the Torah portion about the mountain where Aaron, the brother of Moses, died. And the name of that mountain is Hor Hahar, or I'll just use the English American pronunciation, Hor Hahar, or Mount Hor. And it's a H, like the H in herb. And these Italian Jews who were in my Alpan said Or Aar. And I said, why are you pronouncing it incorrectly? And I asked the teacher, and she said, that's how I pronounce it.
Mm.
You mean there's two dialects of Hebrew and I don't even know about it? And I'm at the time 17 years old. And I never even knew there was another pronunciation of Hebrew. And in fact, the predominant pronunciation in modern Israel is to pronounce the hey as an So the predominant pronunciation is or ar, not or har. Right? Some do still pronounce it correct. I would say correctly, but I'm being facetious, as hol ha. And so the other so the point is this pronunciation of pronouncing the hey as an aleph existed already in the time of Moses, right? You had people who pronounced it Yehochanan, and then people who pronounced it Yochanan, and there's people who are saying his mother's name is Yocheved. In fact, that's the dominant form, right? So the point is that this is this is really like herb and herb, right? And it's not that one is right and one is wrong, right? You speak Australian English, I speak American English, right? And some people say herb and some people say herb, and some people say H and some people say H. Now, the linguists will say, H is what's called a overcorrection. That's what it's called, right? So Australians realized that they dropped, or maybe people in London originally, right? Not Australians, dropped the H, and they wanted to put the H back in, and they put it in places it didn't belong. And that's probably true where the H pronunciation came from. But now, if you're learning the alphabet in Australia, I'm sure they tell you H is the correct pronunciation. Am I right?
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah, okay. And it's right in Australian English and certain places in the UK. H in American English would be pretty unusual. Maybe there are places where they pronounce it that way. So the point is we have that in Hebrew in the time of Moses. I believe it's the time of Moses, where it's Yocheved and Yehocheved. Right? Or Yocheved is the dominant one. And it's not, there's no ban on the name in the time of Moses. Okay. Right? That's not a thing. It's everybody's saying the name all the time, and at least the ones who know it. And so her name is just Yocheved.
So just another quick question. Do you think the Masoretic vowel pointings are original?
So my view on that has evolved over time as I've learned more things. And I'm going to give you the really short answer standing on one leg. And we have 5 minutes. That's a Hebrew expression, standing on one leg, meaning the amount of time I can balance on one leg, which for me is not too long. I don't even think it's 5 minutes. So let's start with this. Within Jewish sources, there's a debate about whether the vowel points as graphic symbols were part of the original Torah given on Mount Sinai, or whether the text was naked, meaning it wasn't with vowel points, but the people knew how to read it because they could read Hebrew. That's a debate within Judaism. And it's a debate that still exists today, in fact. The first one, to my knowledge, to suggest that the vowel points, and I mean as graphic symbols, there's no such thing as a language without vowels. Let's back up. Right? People say originally Hebrew had no vowels. That's not true. No scholar says that. What they say is the vowels weren't written down as graphic symbols. Right? Of course it is vowels. The only language that potentially could have no vowels would be sign language, or a language that only exists in written form. Every spoken language by definition has consonants and vowels. Maybe they don't call them consonants and vowels, but they exist in every spoken language. As far as I know, I don't know how you could have a language without them, even if they're just transition vowels. like in Polish, you have these clusters of like five consonants, but they have some kind of, anyway, that's a special case. But they still have vowels in Polish. So Hebrew always had vowels. Nobody disputes that. What they dispute in Judaism, this isn't just modern scholars who say this. There was a rabbi named Eliyahu Bachor, or Elijah Levitas, and he came up with this idea in the 16th century that the vowels weren't originally written down. And it's become more popular, and it's universally accepted in academia now that the vowels weren't originally written down, but that they were oral. So where do they come from? So one secular scholar has written that they were a tradition of pronunciation from the Second Temple period. Another secular scholar would say, no, the Masoretes in the 6th or 7th century made them up. They said, in this instance, we know grammatically this word is, Vayomer, and so they put in the vowels of Vayomer, right? So I think the first one's probably right. I mean, there's good reason to think that these go back to an earlier reading tradition that predates the time they were written down. I don't rule out the possibility they were written down, but at this point, I'd like to, and I've said that in the past that, I believe they were written down, but now I would say I'd like to see more evidence that they were written down. I think there is I think the better evidence, and it's interesting because in Christianity, this was a big debate. There was a time in the Christian world where you would be excommunicated from your church if you said that you didn't believe the vowels were given at Mount Sinai. The Hebrew vowels of the Hebrew text, which is incredible. Who knew that Christians cared about that? But they did. It's pretty incredible. That was a major issue within Christianity. It was probably a bigger issue in Christianity than in Judaism, because in Judaism they said, okay, so some rabbi thinks they were from the time of Ezra rather than from Mount Sinai. Who cares, right? Doesn't change that we consider them authoritative, right? But in Christianity, if they're not written down, in Protestantism in particular, if they weren't written down, they weren't authoritative, right? That was the thought. So it's interesting. That was more of an issue in Christianity, in Protestantism, than it was in Judaism at the time, in like the 16th, 17th century. So somebody needs to research that topic some more because it's a really fascinating thing. The history of that still hasn't been fully written. It's been partially written, but not fully written. Okay. So, and then a lot of it had to do with what they thought. Anyway, I won't go into that rabbit trail. So so I appreciate you having me on. It's been 2 hours, and I don't want to. Yeah. I've got to get some things. I wish I could stay here with you all day. It's finally the morning for you. It's probably time for your brekkie or whatever you people call it.
Yeah, brekkie. Yeah. But I've really enjoyed this, Nehemia, and thanks for coming on the show. I just want to say, look, and a bit of an apology. I listened to your interview with Kent Hovind, and a lot of Christians follow him for the creation research stuff that he did, but I felt that he was a bit of a jerk to you. And I just want to apologize on behalf.
I should have thicker skin. Just at the moment, if October 7th hadn't happened, I don't know that I would react so. I think I would have just brushed it off and laughed. But especially following October 7th, the response being, well, it didn't happen, but you Jews deserved it. And this is an outpouring of anti-Semitism that I haven't seen in my lifetime, certainly not in the Western world. I think in that context, maybe I'm a bit more sensitive to it. So
I just sort of mentioned that just on the outro. But I really appreciate your scholarship. I appreciate your input. Have you got any last words for the audience before we shut this off?
Yeah, well, I appreciate those who have made it for the full 2 hours. And I'm sure I've said many things that were incorrect. And there's this expression in Europe, the elevator response, which is you just left somebody's apartment and you're coming down in the elevator, or they call it the stairs response. You're walking down the stairs and you think, oh, I should have said such and such. So I'm sure 5 minutes from now, I'll realize I said something that was completely wrong. So guys, go to my website, nehemiaswall.com, and hopefully there I didn't make a mistake. But hopefully in 2 hours, I only had 2 or 3 mistakes.
I think you did really well. And I really appreciate having you.
That should be a reminder just to keep studying and doing your own research, because I don't have all the answers, and sometimes I have the answers and I still say the wrong thing. So keep doing your own research. And what I appreciate about you is that, from what I've been told, and I don't think we discussed this, but I'm sure your audience knows it better. But what I appreciate is that, you're a believer in the Textus Receptus, and that's completely contrary to the scholarly consensus. And you don't care. You're going to follow the evidence where it leads, and maybe you're wrong. I have no idea if you're right or wrong. That's not my expertise. But you're willing to follow what you think is right, even if everybody else thinks it's wrong. So I think that's one of the things they say about Einstein is the reason he came up with so many wonderful discoveries is because he had a form of autism, which I also have, which made him follow what he thought was right, even if everybody else said he was wrong, because he really didn't care what anybody else said. If he was convinced he was right, he just thought, well, I haven't been proven yet. So I appreciate that. I think that sometimes that can be a problem, but sometimes that can lead to really important discoveries that change the world. And if you just accept the consensus, what everybody says, you're definitely not going to change the world. You'll be right probably most of the time, or maybe you'll be wrong most of the time, but there are things where you'll miss what the truth is. So anyway, thank you for having me.
Okay, well, thanks, Nehemia. And I'm going to play my little outro, and I'll contact you in email later on, and we'll have a bit of a chat. But I really appreciate it. Thank you very much. Okay, well, thanks for joining us, guys. I've got to head out as well. But I didn't even get to touch on the Vaticanus issues. I really wanted to sort of spend half the time on Revelation 16:5 and Jehovah, and the other half on Vaticanus issues. I've got about 20 questions on that, but it just seemed more natural just to stick with the Jehovah issues and to just sort of rabbit trail on those. And so maybe we'll have a part 2 in the future. But yeah, I really appreciate you guys jumping on, and everyone who commented. And yeah, I'm going to play my fancy little outro, and then I'm going to split. And so God bless you guys. Thanks for joining us, and we'll catch you on the next one.